Montana, January 1883, in the heart of a killing blizzard. 3 faint knocks. Gideon grabbed his rifle and pulled the door open. A woman collapsed against the frame, lips cracked, eyes still burning with the last ember of pride she had left, arms outstretching a barely breathing infant toward him. "Please, just take my children. I'll walk back out into the snow." He took the baby without a word, turned toward the fire. "You've got it wrong, ma'am. You're coming inside, too. What secret is hidden inside that baby's coat? And why does the most powerful man in the valley want this widow gone permanently?" Read the full story below. The nightmare came again. It always started the same way. The dry summer grass of the Dakota plains, the crack of rifle fire, and the screaming that never seemed to belong to any single man but rose from everywhere at once. Gideon Thorne was running, his scout boots pounding red dirt, and somewhere behind him a boy was calling his name. Not a soldier, a boy. He always woke before he could turn around. Gideon sat up in the dark, chest heaving, sweat cooling fast against his skin in the January air. The cabin walls shuddered. Wind hit the north-facing logs like something alive and furious, rattling the single window above the wash basin, hard enough to make the glass sing. The hearth fire had burned down to coals, throwing just enough amber light to remind him where he was. Montana, his land, his silence. He pressed the heels of both hands against his eyes and breathed. Slow in, slow out. The army chaplain had told him to count things he could name. Fire, blanket, floor, water bucket, rifle on the wall. Rifle. He lowered his hands, 34 years old, and he still slept lighter than a cat. 3 years out of service, and every sound the Montana hills made at night still registered in his body before it reached his brain. That was the price of being a scout. You learned to read the world in the dark, and then you could never stop. He was reaching for the water cup on the bedside crate when he heard it. 3 knocks. Faint, barely above the howl of the wind. He went still, a branch maybe, ice shifting on the roof. He waited, counting heartbeats. 3 more knocks, slower this time. Deliberate. Human. Gideon was on his feet before the third one landed. He pulled on his boots without lacing them, grabbed his rifle off the wall peg, and crossed the single room in 4 steps. He pressed his back flat against the logs beside the door, habit, and listened. Nothing but wind and the low moan of the pine stand behind the barn. He lifted the latch and pulled the door open. The blizzard came in first, a wall of frozen air, sharp as a blade, carrying with it a swirl of fine-grained snow that hit the coals and hissed. Gideon raised his rifle. Then he looked down. A woman was falling. She crossed the threshold on her knees, one arm wrapped around a bundle, against her chest the other hand, clawing at the doorframe just to keep herself upright. She was soaked through. Her coat, a thin wool thing, nowhere near suited for weather like this, was stiff with ice along the collar and cuffs. Her lips were cracked and dark at the corners. Her hair, dark brown, had come loose from its braid and was plastered to her face in frozen strands. The bundle she was holding moved. A small, pale face turned against her shoulder. A child, barely more than a baby. By the size of him, and the color of his skin was wrong. Too white, too still. Gideon lowered the rifle. He looked past her into the storm. 3 more shapes stood, just beyond the reach of the firelight, huddled together in the dark. Children, older. 2 boys who looked like matching bookends, pressed so close their shoulders overlapped. And a girl, taller, standing slightly in front of the boys, with her arms spread back, shielding them from the worst of the wind. Even from the doorway, he could see their feet were bound in rags. The woman lifted her face to him. Her eyes were brown and fever-bright, and whatever pride had once lived in them was still fighting, even now, even on her knees. Her voice came out in pieces, broken by the cold. "Please," she swallowed. "Just take my children. A breath, they're dying. I'll walk back out into the snow." She looked down at the baby in her arms, pressed her cracked lips to his forehead once, and held him out toward Gideon. "I won't be a burden." Gideon stood in the doorway for exactly 1 second. Then he leaned the rifle against the inside wall, stepped forward, and took the baby from her arms. The child weighed almost nothing. His small body was rigid with cold, but he made a weak sound when Gideon lifted him, and that sound was enough. Gideon turned back into the cabin, crossed to the stove, kicked open the iron door with the toe of his boot, and crouched down to hold the boy close to the heat. "Get those 3 inside," he said, without looking back now. He heard the girl's voice, steady and low, urging her brothers through the door. He heard the shuffle of rag-bound feet on the plank floor. He heard the woman make a small, broken sound and then go quiet. He laid the baby on his own bedroll near the stove and stood up, turned around. The woman was still in the doorway, still on one knee, like she genuinely expected him to close the door on her once the children were in. Gideon looked at her for a moment. He looked at the 3 children standing behind her in his cabin, dripping melted snow onto his floor, watching him with eyes that had learned too young to measure a man's intentions fast. He walked to the door, reached down, and took her arm. "You've got it wrong, ma'am," he said. "You're coming inside, too." She didn't argue. He wasn't sure she had the strength left to. He got her to her feet and guided her toward the stove's warmth, and then he went back and shut the door against the storm. The wind screamed at the wood for a moment, like it was offended, and then the cabin settled back into its own quiet crackle. 4 children, 1 half-frozen woman, 1 rancher who hadn't had company in the better part of 2 years. Gideon stood with his back to the door and looked at them all gathered around his stove. The girl had already moved the baby onto her own lap and was rubbing his hands between hers, quietly and seriously, the same motion over and over. The twin boys were staring at Gideon with identical expressions, some mix of wariness and desperate hope. The woman sat on the edge of his cot with her hands in her lap, her eyes down. Her coat was leaving a puddle on the floor. Gideon went to the supply shelf and pulled down his spare blanket, his only spare blanket, and dropped it around her shoulders without ceremony. Then he went to the stove and started building the fire back up. "What's the baby's name?" he asked. A beat of silence, Toby. Her voice was rough. "He's 3. He breathing all right? He has a cough." She paused. "He's had it since November." Gideon fed 2 more logs into the stove and didn't respond right away. He was listening to the boys' breathing from across the room. Shallow but steady. He'd heard worse. "The twins?" he said. "Jed and Huck. They're 7. The girl, Gemma. She's 10. There was something in the way she said her daughter's name. Something that sounded like both gratitude and grief at once. The particular weight of watching your child grow up too fast." Gideon glanced over his shoulder at Gemma. The girl met his gaze directly, didn't flinch. He turned back to the stove. "I'm Gideon Thorne," he said. Another pause. "Corinne Vance." Her voice had steadied some, now that the warmth was beginning to reach her. "My husband was Frank Vance. He worked the Blackwood mine." Gideon was quiet. He knew the Blackwood mine. He knew what kind of men ran it. "Was," he said. "Was." She confirmed and said nothing more. Outside, the blizzard pushed hard against the walls of the cabin, searching for a way in. The fire crackled and caught and began to push the cold back into the corners. Jed and Huck had pressed themselves together on the rug in front of the stove, and one of them, he couldn't tell which, was already slipping toward sleep. Gideon reached for his iron pot and his last sack of dried beans. There were mouths to feed. That was the first problem. Everything else could wait until morning. The storm could rage all it wanted. In here for tonight, they were alive. That was enough to start with. The beans took an hour. Gideon didn't rush them. He'd learned a long time ago that there were 2 things you couldn't force in this world: a green fire and a frightened person. Both needed time and air before they were any good to anyone. He kept the stove fed and let the cabin warm at its own pace. The frost on the inside of the window slowly fogged over and disappeared. The children's shivering eased from violent to occasional. The color came back into the twins' faces first, then Gemma's, and finally, slowly, into little Toby's lips and fingertips. The boy's breathing still concerned him. There was a faint catch to it, a hitch, at the end of each exhale, that Gideon recognized from field camps where men slept in wet gear. Too long. Not fatal. Not yet, but worth watching. Corinne hadn't moved from the edge of the cot. She sat with his blanket pulled around her shoulders, her back straight even now, and watched her children with an alertness that didn't match how depleted she looked. Every time Toby shifted or coughed, her eyes went to him. Every time one of the twins stirred, her chin turned. She was running on pure instinct, the deepest kind, and it was the only fuel she had left. Gideon stirred the pot and said nothing. He wasn't a man who filled silence with words. The army had cured him of that. You learned fast, as a scout, that unnecessary noise was a liability. You spoke when you had something worth saying. The rest of the time, you paid attention. So he paid attention. He noticed that Gemma, even while sitting close to the fire, kept herself positioned between her brothers and the door. He noticed that Corinne's boots, what was left of them, had no sole to speak of, just a flap of leather held on with twine. He noticed the dark line of bruising along her left wrist, old and yellowed, from weeks back at least, and he didn't ask about it. Not tonight. The beans softened. He added the last of his dried salt pork, a handful of wild onion he'd stored in a jar above the shelf, and a pinch of black pepper. Simple food. Ranch food. He'd eaten the same meal alone 100 times over the past 3 winters, and never thought much of it. Tonight, it smelled different. It smelled like something that mattered. He ladled the soup into his 2 tin bowls, and his 1 clay mug, and his single spare cup that had a crack along the rim he'd never gotten around to fixing. He handed Gemma the clay mug for Toby, told her to blow on it first, and watched her nod like he'd said something completely obvious. He handed the twins the 2 tin bowls and told them to share, and they grabbed opposite sides of the same bowl with a speed that told him they'd been doing exactly that for some time. That left the cup with the crack in it and 1 more serving of soup in the pot. He poured the last of it into the cracked cup and carried it to Corinne. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked toward the children. "Gemma," she said quietly, "does Toby need more?" "He's got plenty, Mama." Corinne looked at the cup in Gideon's hand. He could see her running the calculation. 1 serving left. 4 children. 1 of them sick. She reached out to take the cup, and then she stopped. Her hand hovered. "You haven't eaten," she said. "I ate before sundown," he said. It was a lie, and not a very convincing one. She looked at him. He looked back. He held the cup steady until she took it. She wrapped both hands around it and stared into it for a moment before she drank. Gideon went back to the stove, scraped the bottom of the pot with a spoon, and ate what was left standing up. Barely a mouthful. He'd gone hungry before under a lot less comfortable circumstances. A warm cabin and a working fire made a thin supper feel like plenty. He sat down in his chair by the stove and watched the children eat. Jed and Huck had graduated from cautious sipping to full competitive eating, each trying to get to the bowl first, elbowing without looking at each other in a rhythm that suggested long practice. Gemma fed Toby with her fingers, dipping them in the broth and letting him suck them clean when the mug proved too heavy for him to lift alone. The boy was awake and tracking the room with big, slow eyes, tired but present. Good signs. Corinne finished her soup. She looked at the empty cup in her hands, like she wasn't sure what to do with it. "Thank you," she said. Gideon shrugged one shoulder. "Cold out." "That's not what I mean." He knew it wasn't. He didn't answer. She set the cup down on the floor beside her feet and pulled the blanket tighter. The fire popped. Huck, or possibly Jed, listed sideways and fell asleep mid-bite, his cheek dropping against his brother's arm. The other twin looked down at him with mild irritation, then pulled the bowl closer and kept eating. "You should sleep," Gideon said to Corinne, "all of you." "I'm all right." "You walked through a blizzard." "I'm aware of that," she said. And for the first time, there was a dry edge to her voice, the ghost of a woman who, under different circumstances, might have been funny. He gave her the cot. He gave the 4 children his bedroll spread flat in front of the stove, which was the warmest real estate in the cabin, and he pulled his spare saddle blanket over the back of his chair for himself. It wasn't the first time he'd slept sitting up. It wasn't even close. He banked the fire for the night and turned down the lamp. For a while, the only sounds were the wind outside, the low creak of the cabin settling, and the slow, deepening breath of 4 children falling asleep. Toby coughed once, twice, then went quiet. Corinne shifted on the cot. The ropes under the mattress ticking creaked. Gideon closed his eyes. He did not sleep. He rarely slept well on good nights. Tonight, he simply sat and kept watch, the same way he had on 100 cold camp nights, and he let the sound of other people breathing fill the cabin around him, and he didn't examine what it meant, that it made the darkness a little easier to sit inside. Morning came gray and howling. The storm had not broken. The children woke up gradually. Jed and Huck immediately started a quiet argument about something Gideon couldn't follow, while Gemma shushed them both with the authority of a 10-year-old who had been managing small disasters for years. Toby sat up on the bedroll and looked at Gideon's cabin with the wide, uncommitted curiosity of a 3-year-old who had not yet decided what he thought of things. Corinne was already awake. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, holding a small, badly worn coat in her lap. A boy's coat, too small for Jed or Huck, so it had to be Toby's. She'd clearly taken it off him in the night and replaced it with a corner of the blanket, and now she was turning it over in her hands, examining the seams. "It's the only thing he has left of his father," she said, without Gideon asking. "I keep meaning to patch it. The lining's coming apart." Gideon set water to boil for coffee, such as it was, just chicory root and dried bark, the real stuff having run out in December. He glanced at the coat. "I can mend it," he said. She looked up at him. "I lived alone for 3 winters," he said. "A man learns to sew or he wears rags." She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. She held the coat out to him, and he took it and sat back in his chair with his needle and his waxed thread, and he started working on the lining. He'd gotten through the worst of the torn seam along the left side when his needle caught on something inside the fabric. He stopped, pressed his thumb along the hem of the inner lining, and felt it again. Not stuffing, not worn batting. Something stiff, flat, stitched in deliberately. He looked up at Corinne. "There's something sewn into this lining." She frowned and crossed the room. He turned the coat toward the firelight and worked the seam open carefully with the tip of his needle. Inside, folded tight and stitched flat between the outer wool and the inner cotton, was a strip of heavy canvas fabric about the length of his hand. He pulled it out and spread it across his knee. It was covered in notations, small, dense, carefully drawn. Grid marks, numbers, directional bearings written in a compact hand with what looked like surveyor's shorthand. And in the corner, a rough sketch of what he recognized, after a moment's study, as a section of the northern hill line above Blackwood Valley. Corinne stared at it. "Frank wrote this," she said. "He must have." She reached out and touched the edge of the canvas without taking it. "He never told me what it was. I didn't even know it was there." Gideon looked at the notations again. His eyes moved across the grid marks and the bearing numbers with the practiced focus of a man who had spent 6 years reading exactly this kind of field documentation, military survey maps, scout reports, terrain grids. The Army had trained him to find his position in unmarked wilderness by nothing more than a written bearing and a compass. He could read this. He read it twice through. Then he sat back and looked at the fire. "What?" Corinne said. "What does it mean?" He tapped the grid coordinates at the top of the strip. "These are geological markers. Survey points." He traced the bearing notations with his finger without touching the canvas. "Your husband wasn't just recording where he'd been. He was documenting what he found." He looked up at her. "These coordinates mark a vein. A big one by the pattern of the sample notations. Silver, if I'm reading the mineral codes right. The cabin went very quiet. Corinne sat down on the edge of his chair's footrest without seeming to notice she'd done it. Her eyes were fixed on the strip of canvas. He found silver, she said. Looks like he found a lot of it. She was still for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a terrible, clarifying recognition. The kind that arrives when scattered pieces suddenly arrange themselves into a shape you wish you couldn't see. He told me, she said slowly, the week before he died. He said he'd found something in the North Tunnel. Something big. He said he needed to report it, and he was afraid. Her voice dropped. I told him he was being careful. I told him everything would be fine. Gideon folded the canvas strip carefully and held it out to her. This belongs to you. She took it, held it in both hands. The fire crackled beside them, and outside the blizzard, pushed against the walls, and Gideon watched her face as she understood, slowly and fully, what her husband had died for. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would help, but he filed everything away. The coordinates, the notations, the name she hadn't spoken yet, but that was already forming in the back of his mind, like smoke before a fire. Blackwood, Sterling's operation. A miner who found silver and wound up dead. Gideon reached for his coffee cup, wrapped his hands around the warmth, and looked at the 4 children piled up in front of his stove. He had questions. He'd get his answers in town. But first, these kids needed breakfast. The thaw came 3 days later. Not a true thaw. Montana in January didn't do true thaws. But the wind dropped off sometime before dawn, and by mid-morning the temperature had crawled up far enough that the snow stopped falling and the sky went from iron gray to a flat, pale white that almost passed for daylight. Good enough. Gideon saddled his roan mare before breakfast. Corinne came out of the cabin and stood in the doorway watching him. She had Toby on her hip, the boy bundled in the spare blanket she'd fashioned into something like a wrap. His cough had improved over 3 days of warmth and steady meals, though it hadn't disappeared entirely. You're going to town, she said. Need supplies? He checked the cinch strap and didn't look up. Running low on cornmeal, lamp oil, salt, pork. That's not the only reason. He looked up then. She was watching him steadily, the same direct way her daughter Gemma watched things, head slightly tilted, like she was measuring the distance between what a person said and what they meant. He went back to the cinch strap. I'll be back by dark. She was quiet for a moment. Then, be careful in town, Mr. Thorne. People there know my name. I'm counting on it, he said. He rode out into the pale morning and didn't look back. The trail into Blackwood took 90 minutes on a clear day. Today it took closer to 2 hours. The snow was packed deep in the low places, and he kept the mare to a walk where the ground was uncertain, trusting her feet more than his eyes in the flat, shadowless light that made it impossible to tell a shallow drift from a 4-foot drop. He used the time to think. He'd spent 3 evenings at his table, with the canvas stripped from Toby's coat, working through the notations by lamplight while the children slept. His scout training had given him a solid enough foundation in field surveying to follow Frank Vance's methodology, and the more he worked through it, the clearer the picture became. The man had been thorough. Whatever else Frank Vance was, he'd been careful. The coordinates were precise, the sample notations methodical, and the geological markers consistent with a significant silver deposit running along the northern face of the Blackwood Ridge. It was real, and it sat squarely within the boundary lines of the Vance homestead claim, if that claim was still registered. That was one of the things he needed to find out in town. He also needed to understand who knew what and when they'd known it. Blackwood was a mining town, which meant it was a company town, which meant most of what happened in it happened because someone with money decided it should. Gideon had been through enough of them in his scouting days to read the layout fast. One man at the top, a network of obligation and fear, spreading out below him like cracks in frozen ground, And somewhere at the bottom, the working men who kept the whole thing running and got the least out of it. In Blackwood, that man was Mayor Orson Sterling. Gideon had met Sterling exactly once, 8 months ago, when he'd first arrived in the valley and had his one I-required interaction with the local authority to register his land claim. Sterling had been cordial in the performative way of men who needed you to underestimate them. Soft hands, an expensive coat for a frontier town, eyes that moved too fast and settled too deliberately, cataloging everything in the room without appearing to look directly at anything. Gideon had disliked him immediately and quietly. He tied the mare to the rail outside Flynn's general store and went in for his supplies first. That part was real enough. He was genuinely low on cornmeal. He got what he needed, paid, arranged for the sacks to be held until he was ready to ride out, and stepped back into the cold street. That was when he heard his name, Thorne. Sterling was crossing the street toward him. He was dressed for weather that was significantly better than what they were having, in a long wool coat with a fur collar that probably cost more than Gideon's horse. Two men walked slightly behind him at the customary distance of men who were paid to look large and say nothing. Gideon waited. Sterling stopped a few feet away and smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind a man rehearsed in a mirror. "Heard you had some visitors out at your place," Sterling said pleasantly. "Hell of a storm to be having company." "Word travels fast, small town." Sterling spread his hands. "We look out for each other here in Blackwood, which is why I feel it's my duty to say something." He paused, and the pause was designed to feel like consideration, but was actually just pacing. Corinne Vance is a troubled woman. Thorne, debt-ridden. Her husband left her with nothing but liabilities and a bad reputation for stirring up trouble among the mine workers. She is, frankly, a bad omen for anyone who associates with her. He said it smoothly, evenly, like he was offering sound financial advice. "For your own sake, I'd encourage you to send her along." Gideon looked at him for a moment. "Where would you suggest she go?" asked. "It's January. That's not really my concern." "No," Gideon said. "I didn't think it was." Sterling's smile stayed exactly where it was. "I'd hate to see a hard-working man's ranch get caught up in her complications. She has debts. There are legal matters pending. These things have a way of spreading like rot in a fence post." "I appreciate the warning," Gideon said, in a tone that communicated the opposite. He stepped around Sterling and walked down toward the land records office. He spent 40 minutes in there, going through registered claims with the clerk, a young man named Porter, who had the anxious energy of someone who had been told more than once to be careful what he shared, and with whom Gideon kept his questions general and his manner bored, like a man settling a minor property curiosity, and Porter relaxed enough to be useful. The Vance homestead claim was still registered. Frank Vance had filed it 4 years ago and paid the holding fee through the end of last year. It hadn't been contested or transferred. Yet, there was a notation in the margin, made in a different hand, more recent ink. Gideon read it upside down, across the counter, without changing his expression. It referenced a pending debt review tied to the claim, initiated by the Blackwood Merchant Bank. Sterling's bank. He thanked Porter and walked out. He stood in the cold street for a moment, putting it together. Frank Vance finds a silver vein on his own homestead claim. He's careful enough to document it precisely, and smart enough to hide the documentation. He tells his wife he's afraid. Within a short time, he's dead. Sterling moves to push Corinne off the land and out of town, using debt and social pressure as his tools. When that isn't fast enough, he drives her into a blizzard in January. It wasn't complicated. It was just ruthless. Gideon was still standing there, thinking when he heard the mare whinny. He looked up. A man he didn't recognize was standing too close to her, not threatening, but close enough to make her shift on the rail. The man wasn't looking at the horse. He was looking at Gideon. He had the specific stillness of someone who had been posted there to deliver a message through proximity alone. Sterling making a point. Gideon was being watched. He walked back to the mare, untied her, loaded his supplies, and rode out of town at a steady walk. Not fast enough to look rattled, not slow enough to be stupid. He was 3 miles out on the trail when his instincts started pulling at him. Not fear, just that particular alertness, the one that had kept him alive through 6 years of scouting. The low hum at the back of the neck that said something in the pattern was wrong. He pushed the mare to a trot. He came over the last rise above his property, with the light failing fast in the west, the sky going from pale white to the cold blue of early dusk. From up there he could see the cabin, smoke from the chimney, the children's tracks in the snow around the woodpile, small boot prints in every direction, and a single set of larger tracks leading to the front door. Boots, a man's boots, heavy ones. He came off the rise at a canter. He was still 30 yards out when the cabin door swung open. Corinne came through it walking forward, not running, with Gideon's spare axe in both hands, the heavy splitting axe he kept at the woodblock. Behind her, in the doorway, Gemma had all 4 younger siblings pressed against the back wall. A man in a heavy coat was backing up across the porch, both hands raised, not out of fear exactly, but out of the sudden practical recognition that the woman in front of him was not going to stop. "I already told you," Corinne said, her voice carrying across the yard hard and clear in the cold air. "You come on to this property again without an invitation, and I will not be asking you to leave twice." The man saw Gideon coming and made the calculation fast. He stepped off the porch, went to his horse at the far rail, and was mounted and moving before Gideon had crossed the yard. He didn't look back. Gideon pulled up, watched him go, and then turned to Corinne. She was still holding the axe with both hands. Her jaw was set. Her breathing was controlled, even the deliberate steadiness of someone who had been scared and had not let the fear run things. "Sterling's man?" Gideon asked. "He didn't give his name," she said. "He gave me a message. Sterling wants me to present myself in town. Something about legal matters and pending claims." She paused. "He was in the cabin when I came back in from the woodpile, standing in the middle of the room." Gideon looked at the door, then back at her. "He went through our things," she said. "Looked through the children's coats. He was searching for something." She didn't have to say what. Gideon got down from the mare and took the reins over her head. "You did right," he said. Corinne looked at the axe in her hands like she was registering its weight for the first time now that the moment had passed. She lowered it and carried it back to the woodblock without any drama, set it in the notch, and dusted her palms on her skirt. "I wasn't going to let him stay in there with my children," she said simply. "I know it," Gideon said. He led the mare to the barn, his mind already moving past what had happened here to what it confirmed. Sterling was moving faster now. The canvas strip had made Frank Vance worth killing. Now it made Corinne worth controlling. He needed to act before Sterling found a way to make it legal. Inside the cabin, he could hear Jed and Huck arguing over something by the fire, and Gemma's patient voice cutting through the noise to settle it. The sound of ordinary children in a warm place. He had to keep it that way. He unsaddled the mare, fed her, forked fresh hay into the stall, and stood for a moment in the dim barn with his hand on her neck, thinking through what he knew and what he still needed to know. Sterling had motive. He had resources. He had the local marshal in his pocket, probably, and the bank documents to create the legal appearance of legitimacy. What he didn't have was the canvas strip, and he didn't know that Gideon Thorne had spent 3 years in the United States Army reading exactly the kind of surveyor's documentation that Frank Vance had said sewn into his son's coat. That was the gap, and Gideon intended to use it. He closed the barn and walked back across the dark yard toward the light of the cabin windows, the cold biting at his face, the snow hard and clean under his boots. Tomorrow he'd start making a plan. Tonight, someone had to cook supper. January gave way to February the same way a stubborn man gives ground, slowly, without admitting it was happening, and only after considerable pressure. The storms came and went. Between them, the sky would clear to that particular deep blue that only existed at high altitude in winter, hard and bright and cold enough to make your eyes water just looking at it. The snow on the hills took on a crust by midday that caught the light and threw it back in every direction. On those afternoons, the valley looked like something painted by a man trying too hard to prove beauty existed. Gideon barely noticed. He had a ranch to run, and 4 children underfoot. The children had settled into the cabin like they'd been doing it for years, which said more about their circumstances than about any particular talent for adaptability. Kids who'd had stable, easy lives needed time to adjust to new places. Kids who'd already learned that the world shifted without warning, simply found their footing and kept moving. Jed and Huck found their footing immediately and used it primarily to get into things. By the end of the first week, Gideon had retrieved one of his spare boot laces from the rafter beam where they'd tied it, discovered his good compass had been borrowed for what they described as an important expedition to the woodpile, and been presented with a very dead field mouse that Huck had found under the barn floorboards and seemed to consider a trophy. Gideon accepted it without comment, praised the find with the gravity it apparently deserved, and disposed of it when Huck went back inside. Gemma watched all of this with quiet approval. Toby got better. The cough that had worried Gideon through those first nights faded over 2 weeks of warm sleeping and regular meals until it was gone entirely. He was a quiet boy by nature, content to sit near whoever was working and observe, carrying on occasional private conversations with a wooden spool that Gideon had given him from the mending box. The spool, as far as Gideon could determine, had a complex personality and several opinions. He didn't ask about the spool. Some things a man left alone. Corinne had started managing the ranch from the second week. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce it. She simply began. The morning after Gideon came back from Blackwood with his supplies and his grim set of conclusions, by washing every dish in the cabin, reorganizing the supply shelf in a way that made the inventory obvious at a glance, and sweeping the floor so thoroughly that Gideon found himself wondering if it had ever actually been swept before, which, if he was honest, it probably hadn't. Then she went through his ledger book. He found her at the table that evening, with it open in front of her, a stub of pencil in her hand, frowning at the columns. "You've been overpaying Flynn for cornmeal by 4 cents a pound," she said without looking up. Gideon sat down across from her. "Have I since October by these records? That's either a pricing error, or he's decided you don't notice." She made a notation. "I'll correct it next order." He looked at the ledger. Her handwriting was clean and precise. The numbers set in neat columns that already looked better organized than his own entries. "You have a head for figures," he said. "Frank never trusted me with the accounts." She said it matter-of-factly, no particular heat to it. He thought finances were men's business. "I kept a separate book of my own just to know what was happening." She closed the ledger and looked at him. "I'm not going to sit here and be a burden to you, Mr. Thorne. If I'm going to take up space on this ranch, I'll carry my portion of it." He nodded once. "The ledger's yours. I'll keep the receipts." She gave him a short nod back, the business-like nod of a woman who'd just negotiated something important and intended to honor it fully. After that, the division of the ranch's work arranged itself without any formal discussion. Corinne ran the interior. Gideon ran the exterior. They met in the middle at mealtimes and in the evenings when the work allowed it, and the quality of life on the ranch improved in ways that Gideon registered but didn't comment on, because commenting on them would have required a vocabulary he hadn't had much occasion to use. He addressed the children's feet. He'd been thinking about it since the first night, when he'd cut the frozen rag wrappings off their feet and seen the state of them, blistered and raw in places, the skin cracked at the heels, toes still slightly swollen from the early stages of frostbite that had, fortunately, not gone deep. They'd healed well over the following weeks, but they needed real boots, proper ones. He had good leather. He'd bought a hide in November, intending to replace his own worn pair in the spring, and he had his tools. It took him 10 evenings of work by lamplight, measuring each child's foot against a piece of brown paper and cutting the pattern, careful and slow. Gemma sat with him the first evening and watched the whole process with focused attention. Asking questions, he answered straight, without simplifying. "Why do you cut the soles separate from the upper?" she asked. "So each piece can be worked to the right thickness before you join them. You try to cut them together. The leather's uneven. Boots that are uneven at the sole wear out fast and turn your ankle besides." She watched his hands. "Can I try?" He handed her the smaller awl and showed her the angle. She punctured the leather on the first attempt, clean and correct. He didn't make a production of it. "Good," he said, and went back to his own piece. She came back the next evening and the one after that. The boots took shape over 2 weeks. 4 pairs sized for each child with double-layered soles and a simple but solid stitch along the welt. He kept them plain, no decoration, nothing that would wear down fast. On the morning, he finished the last pair. He set all 4 on the table in a row and stood back and looked at them. Corinne came in from outside and stopped. She looked at the boots. Then she looked at him. There was an expression on her face that he found difficult to look at directly, something that had too much in it for a person to comfortably receive, so he went to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee instead. Gemma helped with the stitching on the smallest pair, he said. He called the children in and fit each pair properly, which required chasing Huck back to the table twice when he ran off to try his before the left boot was properly laced. He adjusted the fit where it was needed and replaced one lace that was too short, and when all 4 of them were standing on his cabin floor in real leather boots, Jed looked down at his feet with an expression of such reverent seriousness that Gideon had to look at the wall for a moment. "Don't run in mud till the leather sets," he told them. "Give it 3 days." Huck looked at him like this was a genuine hardship. 3 days, Gideon repeated, and Huck accepted his fate. The trapping lessons started the following week. It made practical sense. His trap lines needed running regardless, and having 2 extra sets of hands along meant the work went faster. He took Jed and Huck out on a Tuesday morning when the cold was manageable, and he walked them through the basics with the same directness he'd applied to everything else. Where to set, why the location mattered, how to read animal sign in the snow, how to check a trap without losing a finger. Both boys were fast learners when the subject held their interest, and trapping, it turned out, held their interest considerably better than anything that required sitting still. He brought Gemma along on Thursday. She'd asked, he'd said yes. He didn't see any reason to say otherwise. They went farther up the ridge than he'd taken the boys, because Gemma's longer legs and steadier temperament meant she could manage the terrain. She was quiet on the trail in the specific way that meant she was storing things up rather than having nothing to say. He showed her how to read the wind line and which direction animals traveled in cold weather and why. And she listened to all of it and asked exactly the right questions. On the way back down the ridge, he stopped to check the last line and found it had been sprung by something too big for a rabbit and too fast for the trap to hold. He showed her the tracks. "Fox," she said immediately. "Good." He looked at the track pattern and then at her. "How'd you know?" "The spread between the pads and the stride is longer than a rabbit, but shorter than a coyote." She paused. "Mr. Thorne, will you teach me to shoot?" He looked at her for a moment. "Why?" "Because there was a man in our house while my mother was at the woodpile," she said, "and I was the oldest one there, and I had nothing I could do." She said it without dramatics. Just a 10-year-old girl working through a practical problem and arriving at a practical solution. He picked up his trap and reset it. "We'll start this afternoon," he said. He took her out behind the barn with his smallest caliber rifle, a short lever action he'd bought specifically for lighter use, and he spent an hour on the fundamentals before he let her fire a single round. Stance, breath control, sight picture. She listened to every word. When she finally fired, she hit the tin can at 30 yards on the second shot. He showed nothing on his face, but he was, quietly, impressed. Again, he said. She reloaded and hit it on the first shot. He took the rifle back and looked at her levelly. Being a girl doesn't make you any less capable out here in the West, he said. When you're facing a harsh winter or a loaded gun, you have the right to be strong and stand your ground. Gemma held his gaze without blinking. I know that, she said. Good. He handed the rifle back. Then act like it every time, not just when someone's watching. She fired 3 more rounds before the light got too thin to see the can clearly. All 3 hit. He didn't tell her to stop until she decided to stop on her own. And she made that decision herself when she was satisfied with the grouping, not when she was tired or told. That, he thought, was its own kind of lesson. They walked back to the cabin in the cold dusk, the snow blue gray under the fading sky, and he could see the lamp in the window from 100 yards out, warm and steady against the dark. Corinne was at the stove when they came in, and the twins were at the table with a piece of brown paper between them, drawing something elaborate and probably destructive. Toby was asleep near the fire with his spool. Gideon hung his coat and hat and sat down at the table. Corinne set a plate in front of him without being asked. He looked at it, then up at her. She was already moving back to the stove, her attention on the next thing, the way a person moved through work they'd made their own. He picked up his fork. For the first time in a long time, the cabin didn't feel like a place he was enduring. It felt like a place something was happening. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that, but he noted it. The way a scout noted anything that changed the landscape he was moving through, carefully, and without looking away. February ended without ceremony. One morning, Gideon stepped outside before dawn and noticed the air had changed. Still cold, still sharp enough to sting if you breathed too fast, but underneath it was something different, a give, the particular quality of cold that had started letting go. Not spring, not even close to spring, but the season had turned some internal corner that only people who lived close to the land could sense, and the ranch felt it before any calendar confirmed it. The days got longer by minutes. The snow on the south-facing barn roof began to drip at noon. Gideon added a second trap line and started planning for the mud season that would come before anything better did. Life on the ranch had found its rhythm. Mornings belonged to chores. Gideon handled the animals and the exterior work. Corinne managed the cabin and the children and the accounts, all 3 simultaneously, with a quiet efficiency that he'd stopped being surprised by. The twins ran errands between the 2 of them with the selective reliability of 7-year-olds, meaning they completed the tasks that interested them promptly and occasionally forgot the ones that didn't. Gemma had appointed herself Toby's primary keeper on the mornings Corinne was occupied, and she took the responsibility seriously, which was the only way Gemma took anything. Toby had fully adopted the spool, and also, recently, Gideon's spare boot brush, which he carried around the cabin, conducting what appeared to be inspections. Gideon let this continue. The boy wasn't hurting anything. Evenings had become the part of the day Gideon paid the most attention to without meaning to. After supper, after the children were settled, Corinne would sit at the table with the ledger or her mending, and Gideon would sit in his chair with whatever needed his hands, harness repair or tool sharpening or the slow, meticulous work of reloading cartridges, and they would talk, sometimes about the ranch, sometimes about the children, sometimes about nothing that mattered, which turned out to matter more than he expected. He'd learned that she'd grown up in Ohio, that her father had been a school teacher and had taught her arithmetic and reading, and had apparently also raised her with the firm conviction that a woman's mind was as worth educating as a man's, which, she said, had made her considerably more useful than most people around her expected, and considerably more frustrated than she'd ever fully expressed. She'd learned that he'd grown up in Tennessee, that he'd gone into scouting at 20, because the army paid and the frontier was wide, and he'd needed to put distance between himself and a version of himself he wasn't proud of. That the war, when it came to the places he scouted, hadn't been clean or simple, and that he'd come back from it carrying things he was still in the process of setting down. They didn't press each other past what was offered. There was an unspoken agreement to that, and it held. He was aware of her in ways he didn't examine carefully, the sound of her moving around the cabin in the early morning, before he was fully awake, the particular way she laughed. When Huck said something genuinely funny, which was rarer than Huck imagined, the fact that she'd started leaving his coffee cup already filled, when he came in from morning chores, without either of them ever discussing it. He was aware of all of it, and he kept it in the same part of himself where he kept other things that required patience. He'd learned in the army that some situations resolved themselves if you left them alone long enough. He was applying that principle here with mixed confidence. The night the barn burned started as a quiet night. The children had gone to sleep early. Corinne was at the table, working through a discrepancy in the December supply receipts that had been bothering her for a week. Gideon was doing harness work by the lamp. The wind had picked up after dark, but it wasn't unusual wind, just the standard late winter complaint of the Montana hills. He smelled it first, smoke, but not wood smoke. Something denser, with a char underneath it, that his body recognized before his brain named it. He was out the door in 4 seconds. The barn's east wall was fully involved. The hay stored along that wall, 2 months of winter reserves, was burning with the furious speed of dry tinder, and no shortage of air. The wind was pulling the fire upward and toward the main structure, and the horses inside were already screaming. He hit the barn door at a run. He got both horses out, his mare and the older draft, gelding that he used for heavy work, out through the main doors and into the yard, their eyes white-rimmed with panic, moving too fast to control, so he just cleared the space and let them run. He went back for the tack he could reach, and the winter grain sacks stored near the front, and he was dragging the second grain sack clear when Corinne appeared beside him with the water buckets. She'd already been to the well. Both buckets full, moving at a run across the yard, her hair loose and her coat thrown over her nightdress, and she threw the first bucket at the base of the fire on the east wall without breaking stride. "More water," Gideon said. "I know," she said, already running back. He grabbed the second bucket and followed her lead. They worked the well in shifts, one throwing water while the other pumped and filled. It was a losing fight against the east wall. That hay was gone, and nothing was going to change it. But they had a chance at stopping the fire from spreading to the main roof beams, and that was the fight worth making. Gideon kept his mouth shut and his arms moving. Corinne matched his pace exactly, not waiting to be directed, reading the fire herself and targeting the right spots, the creeping edges, the places where embers were landing on dry wood and beginning to catch. The children appeared in the cabin doorway. Gemma had the twins and Toby behind her and was watching the fire with her jaw set, waiting to be useful. "Stay there," Gideon called. Gemma nodded once and kept the boys back. They fought it for an hour, possibly longer. Gideon lost track of time in the way he always did when his body was fully engaged, everything narrowing to the next bucket, the next spot, the next decision. His arms burned. His back was complaining loudly. The smoke was thick enough in places that he had to turn his face away and cough before he could see clearly again. But the fire didn't take the roof. It took the east wall down to the stone foundation and destroyed every bale of hay stored along it. It scorched the nearest roof beam black and took a bite out of one of the support posts. But the main structure held, and by the time the fire had burned down to smoking debris and wet char, the barn was damaged but standing. Gideon stood in the yard and looked at it. His chest was heaving. His hands were raw from the pump handle. There was a burn along his left forearm where an ember had caught him, not bad. A surface thing, but it was making itself known now that the adrenaline had started letting go. Corinne was standing 4 feet to his left, looking at the same wall. She was breathing hard. There was soot on her face and along her collar, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. And she was looking at the ruined east wall with an expression that he recognized because he'd worn it himself, the expression of a person adding up a loss in real time and arriving at numbers they don't like. That was all the winter hay reserves, she said. Most of it. He looked at the surviving front section. Maybe a quarter left. Will the horses have enough? I'll manage it. He paused. The barn can be repaired in spring. Stone foundation solid. She nodded slowly. Her eyes moved along the burn line and then stopped at the base of the east wall, where the fire had clearly started, concentrated, accelerated. Gideon, she said. She didn't say anything else, just his name, but her voice was asking the question. It was set, he said. He'd seen it when he was pulling the second grain sack out. The spread pattern at the base of the east wall was wrong for an accidental fire. An accidental fire started in one spot and moved. This one had been started in 3 places, along the same wall simultaneously, and fed with something that caught fast. Lamp oil, probably. She was quiet for a moment. Sterling, she said. Almost certainly. She pressed her lips together and looked back at the barn. The anger on her face was clean and controlled, the anger of a woman who had already been through too much to waste energy on anything that wasn't useful. He looked at her in the firelight. What remained of it, the glow off the cooling debris, throwing unsteady light across the yard. She was standing straight, despite the exhaustion, her chin level, her shoulders squared, refusing to shrink in front of the damage. He'd worked beside a lot of people in difficult situations. He knew something about what a person's character looked like when everything was stripped away and they were just operating on whatever they were actually made of. She was made of good material. He didn't know who moved first. He wasn't sure. It mattered. The distance between them, which had been 4 feet, stopped being 4 feet. She turned slightly toward him, and he was already there, and his hands found her face, careful around the soot, and he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle thing. It wasn't the tentative, polite gesture of 2 people testing uncertain ground. It was the kind of kiss that happened between people who'd been holding themselves carefully apart for a long time and had finally run out of reasons to keep doing it. Fierce and brief and real, her hands gripping the front of his coat, his forehead dropping to rest against hers when it ended. They stood that way for a moment, just breathing. Gideon, she said quietly. I know, he said. Neither of them said anything else about it. Right then, there was too much else pressing in. In the morning, the full weight of their position became clear. The hay was the first problem. Without the reserves, feeding the horses through the rest of winter and into early spring would require purchasing more, which required money the ranch ledger didn't currently have in surplus. Corinne laid it out on the table after breakfast with the calm precision she brought to every unpleasant number. And the bottom line was simple. They were short. The second problem arrived on horseback by mid-morning. A rider from town. Young, not Sterling's usual type, probably just a hired messenger. He handed Gideon an official-looking document, sealed with the Blackwood Merchant Bank's mark, and rode out without waiting for a response. Gideon broke the seal and read it standing in the yard. It was a notice of back tax assessment on the ranch property, citing 3 years of underpaid land tax based on a revised county valuation. The amount claimed was steep. The deadline for payment was 30 days. Failure to pay would result in seizure proceedings initiated through the county land office. Sterling had found his angle. Gideon read it twice. Then he folded it precisely and put it in his coat pocket and stood looking at the snow-covered hills for a while. The back tax claim was probably fraudulent. His records showed the payments clearly, every one of them, receipts signed by the county clerk in Gideon's own hand. But a fraudulent claim in a county where the bank held most of the elected officials' debts was still a claim, and contesting it took time they might not have. He went inside. Corinne looked at his face and put the ledger down. He handed her the notice. She read it. She set it on the table with the same careful precision she'd used when she laid out the hay numbers, and then she looked at him, and her eyes were clear and steady. "He's moving on two fronts at once," she said. "The hay to break our resources. The tax notice to create the legal mechanism. Yes, we have the receipts, we do. Then we document everything, and we find someone who can take it to a higher authority than Sterling's county judge." She paused, and we move fast. He nodded. Outside, the wind moved through the burned timbers of the east wall with a low, hollow sound. They were out of time for being careful. Sterling was forcing his hand, and Gideon, for the first time in 3 years of solitary Montana living, had people on his land worth fighting for. He pulled his coat back on and reached for his hat. There were moves to make. He was going to start making them. The week after the fire, Gideon worked. He rode into Blackwood twice. He kept his conversations short and his questions indirect, which was a skill he'd refined over 6 years of scouting in territory, where the wrong question in the wrong place got a man killed. He talked to the feed merchant about hay prices and listened to everything else. He talked to the postal clerk about land registry procedures and learned more from what the clerk wouldn't say than from what he did. He made 2 copies of every receipt in his tax records, writing them out by hand in the evenings after the children slept, with Corinne checking his figures against the originals. One set went into the locked tin box he kept under the floorboards beneath his cot. The other set he sealed in an envelope addressed to a lawyer he'd known briefly during his Army years, a man named Calloway, who'd set up practice in Helena after his discharge, and who, as far as Gideon knew, was not in Sterling's pocket, primarily because Sterling's influence didn't stretch that far north. He sent the envelope on a Tuesday with the eastbound mail rider. Whether it arrived in time to matter was something he couldn't control. He focused on what he could. He also spent an hour each morning that week doing something he hadn't done since leaving the Army, drilling. Not with other men, just himself, behind the barn where the children couldn't see. Basic movement patterns. Positioning. The physical language of a man who understood that if things with Sterling came to a confrontation, it was going to happen fast and in close quarters, and 3 years of ranch work, however physical, was not the same thing as being operationally ready. He didn't tell Corinne about the drilling. She was sharp enough that she probably knew anyway. The notice arrived on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the tax document. This one was delivered by 2 men, not a young messenger. Both of them were large. Both wore badges that identified them as county deputies, and they came with a sealed document bearing the marshal's official mark alongside Sterling's bank seal. Behind them, at the edge of the yard, sat a closed carriage. Gideon stepped onto the porch before they reached the door. "Thorne," the first deputy said. He had the impersonal manner of a man delivering bad news he'd had no part in creating and wanted no part in owning. "Marshal Hicks has authorized this notice. There's a hearing convened for Monday at the Blackwood Courthouse regarding the land tax assessment and an additional matter. You're required to present yourself and any occupants of the property." Gideon took the document and read it on the porch without moving. The tax hearing was what he'd expected. The additional matter was not. It was a financial guarantee claim. According to the document, Corinne's late husband, Frank Vance, had signed a personal financial guarantee with the Blackwood Merchant Bank 18 months before his death, curing a substantial loan against all present and future property claims held by the Vance family, including mining rights. The bank was calling the guarantee due. At the bottom of the document, in language that was carefully legal and entirely clear, was the implication that if the guarantee was not satisfied, all associated property claims, including the homestead and any mineral rights thereunder, would revert to the bank as the secured creditor. Gideon read it twice. Then he folded it and looked at the deputies. "Monday," he said. "Monday," the first deputy confirmed. 9 in the morning. Gideon nodded and went inside. Corinne was at the table. Gemma had taken the younger children to the back of the cabin, understanding, without being told, that the adults needed the front room. Gideon set the document on the table in front of Corinne and stood back. She read it. He watched her face. Her expression moved through several things in the space of a minute. Recognition first, then a rapid, cold calculation, then something that went briefly dark before she brought it back under control. Frank never signed a bank guarantee, she said. I know. He would have told me. We had nothing to guarantee against. He had the homestead claim and his wages and nothing else. She looked up. This signature is false. Almost certainly. Sterling manufactured this. Her voice was level, flat in the way that indicated not an absence of feeling, but a decision to set feeling aside until there was time for it. He's been planning this longer than we thought. This isn't a response to us. This was already prepared. Gideon pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. There's more, he said. She waited. He'd been deciding for 3 days how much to tell her, and he'd come down on the side of all of it, because she was the person most affected, and because she was not a woman who handled being protected from information well. He'd learned that clearly enough. The deputy I spoke to when I was in town Tuesday, he said, not one of Sterling's men, one of the older ones who's been in Blackwood since before Sterling consolidated the mining operations. He told me Sterling has been talking to the marshal about the Vance case, Frank's death. Corinne sat very still. Sterling has apparently suggested, Gideon said carefully, that Frank's death wasn't an accident, and that there may be cause to look at who had interest in the Vance property and the mining claim around the time Frank died. He paused. He's prepared to direct that inquiry toward me. She stared at him. You weren't here when Frank died, she said. You arrived after. You had nothing to do with it. I know that. You can prove it. In a fair proceeding, probably yes. He kept his voice even. In a proceeding run by Marshal Hicks, in a courthouse where Sterling controls the judge, proof is less predictable than it ought to be. He let that sit for a moment. Under frontier law, a charge of murdering a minor, to seize his widow, and her silver claim carries a mandatory sentence. It doesn't go to territorial court. It gets decided locally, fast. She understood what he wasn't saying. Her eyes were steady and direct on his face. He'd hang you, she said. That's the leverage, Gideon said. Yes, the fire crackled. From the back of the cabin, Toby said something to his spool. One of the twins shushed him in a whisper. Corinne looked at the document on the table. She looked at it for a long time. He could see her working through it. Not emotionally, though the emotion was there under the surface, doing what it did. She was working through it, the way she worked through the ledger, methodically, mapping the position they were in, and what the available moves were, and what each move cost. She arrived at the answer before he expected her to. If I go with him, she said quietly, sign over what he wants, present myself as compliant with the proceeding, he has no reason to pursue the murder charge. He gets what he came for. He leaves you alone. Corinne, the children would be in town. They'd be warm. He has no interest in harming them. They're not useful to harm. She was still looking at the document. And if I comply publicly, it removes his pretext for coming after you. He can't call in the marshal on a man who's no longer sheltering the widow he wants. That's his plan working, Gideon said. Exactly as he designed it. I know what it is. She looked up at him. But you'd be alive. We're not there yet, he said. Monday is 4 days away. I have options I haven't exhausted. What options? I'm working on them. She looked at him for a moment, measuring whether that was something real or something he was saying to buy her comfort. He held her gaze and let her measure. 4 days, she said. 4 days. She nodded once, and the conversation moved on, and neither of them returned to it that evening. But Friday came, and then Saturday, and the options Gideon was working on were moving slower than he needed them to. The letter to Calloway and Helena had not yet produced a response. The documentation he was building against the fraudulent guarantee was solid but not yet complete. The alliance he'd been quietly cultivating among two of the older miners in the valley, men who'd known Frank Vance and had their own unspoken doubts about the official account of his death, was there but fragile, and he wasn't sure they were ready to act on it publicly. Sunday came cold and clear. The children spent the morning playing in the yard. The snow had crusted hard enough to hold their weight in places, and Jed and Huck had developed an elaborate game involving the crust that Gideon couldn't follow the rules of, but that produced a lot of noise and periodic negotiation. Gemma sat on the porch steps with Toby, helping him build something from sticks she'd collected from the woodpile edge. Gideon stood at the fence and watched them and thought about Monday. He heard the horses before he saw them. 3 riders coming down the trail from the north, Sterling in the middle, his fur-collared coat very visible against the snow. Marshal Hicks on his left, a heavy-set man who wore his authority the way some men wore an ill-fitting coat, uncomfortably and with constant adjustment. And on Sterling's right, a man Gideon recognized as the same one who'd come to the cabin alone weeks ago and left when Corinne picked up the axe. They came into the yard at a walk, deliberate, unhurried, the pace of men who believed they controlled what was about to happen. Gideon moved from the fence to the center of the yard. Corinne had come out of the cabin and stood on the porch. Gemma had pulled Toby close and moved the children to the far end of the porch steps without being told. Sterling reined in and looked down at Gideon. "I thought we'd save everyone the formality of Monday," he said pleasantly. "Simpler to resolve things here." Marshal Hicks produced the seizure warrant. He read it with the practiced drone of a man, reciting something he'd read many times, the language of debt and default and legal authority. And at the end, he looked at Gideon with an expression that was apologetic in a way that meant nothing. Then Sterling nudged his horse forward slightly and looked past Gideon toward the porch. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "the bank's position is clear. I'd prefer to handle this without further complication." He paused, and the pause was the threat. "However," he continued, "it occurs to me that Mr. Thorne's situation is more precarious than he may have disclosed to you. There are serious questions being raised about his conduct in the period preceding your husband's death. The kind of questions the marshal takes very seriously." Hicks nodded, exactly on cue. "If those questions proceed to a formal inquiry," Sterling said, "the outcome for Mr. Thorne would be severe." He let that word sit in the cold air. "If, on the other hand, the matter of the bank's claim is resolved cooperatively and without contest, there would be no particular reason for such an inquiry to move forward." He looked at Corinne directly. "It's a simple choice, Mrs. Vance. Come with us today, sign the transfer at the bank, and Mr. Thorne faces no charges." Gideon kept his eyes on Sterling and his hands loose at his sides, and his position exactly where it was. He heard Corinne's boots cross the porch. He heard her come down the porch steps. He turned his head and looked at her, and she was looking at him, and in her eyes was everything they hadn't said, and everything she was deciding, and he saw the moment she made the decision, and he saw that she'd made it for him. "Corinne," he said. His voice was low and hard. "Don't. Take care of them," she said. Just that. She walked across the yard toward Sterling's carriage, past Gideon, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his arm, and she didn't look at him again, because if she looked at him again, she wouldn't keep walking, and they both knew it. Sterling's man was down from his horse and had the carriage door open. Sterling himself sat very still, watching with the satisfaction of a man whose plan had arrived exactly where he'd aimed it. Gideon took one step forward. The third rider moved his horse sideways and blocked him, not dramatically, just efficiently, and when Gideon looked up at the man, he was looking down the barrel of a revolver. "Easy," the man said. Gideon stopped. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched the carriage door close. He watched Sterling turn his horse. He watched Hicks tuck the seizure warrant into his coat pocket with an air of completed business. Then the carriage started moving. He stood in the snow and watched it go down the trail, getting smaller, and the cold came in around him from every direction, and behind him on the porch the twins had gone completely silent for the first time he could remember. Then a small hand found his. He looked down. Toby was standing beside him, looking up at him with wide, serious eyes, his free hand holding his spool against his chest. Gideon looked back down the trail where the carriage had disappeared into the tree line. He stood there for another 10 seconds, feeling everything, all of it, the fury and the cold and the particular helplessness of a man who'd been outmaneuvered by someone willing to use an innocent woman as a piece on a board. Then he squeezed Toby's hand once and let it go. "Gemma," he said, without turning around. "Yes, sir," she said from the porch. "Get your brothers inside and stay there. Are you going after her?" He picked up his hat from where it had fallen in the snow when he'd taken that single blocked step forward. "I'm going to do something better than that," he said. He walked toward the barn. He had work to do, and he had until Monday morning to do it, and standing in the yard feeling it wasn't going to be enough. He was done being outmaneuvered. He saddled the mare in the dark. Not the full dark of midnight, but the early dark of a winter evening that had come down fast and final, the sky pressing low and starless over the hills. He worked by feel more than sight, his hands finding the cinch and the breast collar from memory. 6 years of scouting had left him able to tack a horse in conditions where he couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. A moonless Montana evening barely qualified as difficult. Gemma appeared in the barn doorway, holding the lamp. He hadn't asked her to. She'd done it because she understood that he needed light and that he wouldn't ask for it, which was, he thought, a considerable amount of insight for a 10-year-old. He accepted it without comment. "The boys are asleep," she said. "Toby, too? Good. Are you coming back tonight?" He pulled the stirrup down and checked the length. "Before morning." She was quiet for a moment, the lamp steady in her hand. "You have a plan?" It wasn't really a question. He looked at her. "Working on one," he said. She nodded with the gravity of a person who understood that working on one was different from having one, but was at least better than the alternative. She held the lamp until he led the mare out, then took it back inside without being told. He rode toward Blackwood at a trot. The trail was hard underfoot, the cold having locked the mud from the last thaw into solid ground that gave his mare clean footing. He pushed her as fast as was sensible in the dark, not reckless, but steady, the pace of a man with a deadline, and enough self-control not to let urgency override judgment. He had until Monday morning, call it 36 hours. He ran through what he had. The tax receipts were documented and copied. The canvas strip from Toby's coat was secured in the tin box under the floorboards. He had a working knowledge of the fraudulent guarantee's weaknesses, primarily that Frank Vance had no record of visiting the Blackwood Bank in the period the document claimed, and that at least one other person in town might be able to confirm that. What he didn't have was standing. That was the problem he kept arriving at. A single man, a relative newcomer to the valley, presenting documents against the town's most powerful figure in front of a judge that figure had likely hand-selected, was not a man with standing. He was a man with paper. He needed people, not a mob, not something angry and uncontrolled that Sterling could dismiss as a rabble or use as a justification for calling in additional law. He needed credible people. People with their own history in this valley, their own grievances, their own reasons to stand up in public and say what they knew. He knew where to start. He came into Blackwood from the South Trail and kept off the main street. He tied the mare behind the feed store and went on foot to the back of Mrs. Hetty Fletcher's laundry, which backed up against the alley between the hardware and the seamstress's shop. There was a light in the rear window. There usually was, this time of evening. Mrs. Fletcher, by general reputation, kept later hours than anyone else in Blackwood and minded more of its business. He knocked on the back door. A pause, then her voice, sharp and without any particular alarm, which suggested she received backdoor evening visitors with some regularity. "Who is it?" "Gideon Thorne." Another pause, shorter. Then the bolt slid back, and the door opened 4 inches, and one eye looked out at him with the assessing quality of a woman who had been evaluating people's characters and motives for several decades, and had gotten extremely good at it. "You're Corinne Vance's rancher," she said. "I'm my own rancher," he said. "But yes." The door opened the rest of the way. Hetty Fletcher was 60, or thereabouts, small and upright, with silver hair, pulled back tight, and hands that looked like they'd been working since before Gideon was born, which they probably had. She ran the town laundry with 2 assistants and a scheduling efficiency that, according to the postal clerk, put the mail service to shame. She was watching him from the doorway with the direct, no-patience expression of someone who wanted to know what he was there for and intended to decide quickly whether she cared. "Sterling took Corinne today," he said. "Brought the marshal, used a fabricated bank guarantee to force her into town, and threatened a murder charge against me as leverage to keep her from fighting it." Mrs. Fletcher's expression didn't change. "By when?" "2 hours after it happened." She stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." "I'm not heating the alley." He stepped inside. The back room of the laundry was warm and smelled of clean linen and lye soap and the faint cedar of the wood she burned. She poured him coffee without asking whether he wanted it, which he appreciated, and set it on the work table between them and remained standing. "What do you want from me?" she said. "Information first," he said, "then possibly a decision." She crossed her arms. "Ask." "You've been in Blackwood longer than Sterling." 12 years longer. "Frank Vance." "You knew him?" "Brought his laundry in every other Friday for 4 years." She paused. "He owed me nothing when he died. Paid his accounts." "Did he ever mention the bank? A loan? Any arrangement with Sterling's operation?" "Frank Vance," she said precisely, "did not trust Orson Sterling any further than he could throw the man's bank vault. He told me so directly. On more than one occasion." She paused again. "He also told me, roughly 6 weeks before he died, that he'd found something in the North Tunnel and that he was going to need to be careful about who he told and how." Gideon looked at her. "You didn't report that to anyone? Who exactly was I going to report it to?" "The marshal, who's been eating Sterling's cooking for 3 years." She picked up her own coffee cup. "I'm a laundrywoman, Mr. Thorne. I pay attention because that's all I can do. I've been waiting for someone with the capacity to do something about it to walk through that door." He nodded slowly. "I need Monday morning. The courthouse. I need people standing in that room who have their own voices and their own reasons to use them." "The miners," she said. "Yes. You've spoken to any of them?" "2. Briefly. They're not ready to stand up publicly. Yet." She set her cup down. "Let me talk to them." He looked at her. "They trust me," she said simply. "I've washed their clothes for 12 years. I know their wives. I know their children's names." She said it without any particular pride in it. Just the plain fact of a woman who had spent 12 years building the kind of quiet social credit that men like Sterling never bothered to accumulate, because they'd always relied on a different currency. "Give me tonight and tomorrow. I'll have you the people you need." He studied her face for a moment. She looked back at him with complete steadiness. "All right," he said. He left Mrs. Fletcher's back door and went to find the miners himself. He'd spoken briefly to 2 of them in the past weeks. Caleb Marsh, a 10-year veteran of the Blackwood mine, who'd been a foreman before Sterling restructured the operation 3 years ago and reduced him to line work. And Pete Dunmore, older, a Welshman who'd come to Montana in the silver rush of the 70s and had stayed because the land had taken hold of him. Both men had their own grievances. Both had stopped just short of committing to anything. Tonight, he needed them past that line. He found Marsh at his house on the east edge of town, a small, well-kept place with a light in the front window. Marsh came to the door cautious, read Gideon's face, and stepped outside rather than invite him in, which was the habit of a man who protected his family by keeping his trouble on the porch. Gideon told him about Corinne, about the fabricated guarantee, about the murder charge held over his head like a hammer. Marsh listened with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He's been doing this kind of thing for 3 years, Marsh said. To the miners, one man pushes back, Sterling finds something. A debt, a citation, a reason. And the man backs down because he's got a wife and kids. He paused. Frank Vance pushed back. We all know what happened to Frank. Do you know it? Gideon said. Or do you suspect it? Marsh looked at him for a long moment. There was a safety latch on the number 3 shaft support system. It failed the day Frank died. 3 of us reported to the foreman the week before that the latch mechanism was worn and needed replacing. He paused. The foreman told us it had been inspected and signed off. We asked to see the inspection report. We were told it wasn't available for line workers to review. Who signs off on equipment inspections? Gideon said. The site manager, Marsh said. Who answers directly to Sterling? Gideon filed it. Monday morning. The courthouse. I need you there. Marsh was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Gideon didn't push it, just stood in the cold and let the man think. What time? Marsh said finally. 8 o'clock, before the hearing starts. Marsh nodded once. I'll bring Dunmore. He found Dunmore next and had a shorter version of the same conversation, because Marsh had apparently already spoken to him at some point, and the old Welshman was further along than Gideon had expected. I've been ready, Dunmore said flatly. I was waiting for someone who had something to bring to the fight besides anger. Anger's useless in a courtroom. He squinted at Gideon. You have something? I have documentation, Gideon said. And I need witnesses, Dunmore grunted. 8 o'clock. Gideon rode back to the ranch in the late dark, his mind running through the structure of what Monday needed to look like. He'd worked enough field operations to understand that a plan was only as strong as its sequencing. The right information presented at the wrong moment was as useless as no information at all. He needed to walk into that courthouse with everything arranged in the right order, each piece supporting the next. What he had was solid. The decoded coordinates, proving the silver vein, lay within Corinne's homestead claim. The tax receipts disproving Sterling's fraudulent assessment. Marsh and Dunmore, who could speak to Frank Vance's character, to his distrust of the bank, and to the failed safety latch. Mrs. Fletcher, who could confirm Frank's state of mind in the weeks before his death. What he still needed was something that tied Sterling directly to the equipment failure, not just suspicion, something a room full of people could look at. He was still working on that problem when he got back to the ranch and found Gemma asleep. In the chair by the door, the lamp burned low beside her. He stood there and looked at her for a moment, then got his extra blanket and put it around her without waking her. He sat at the table in the dark and thought until the pre-dawn cold got into the cabin, enough to tell him it was time to rebuild the fire. Sunday passed in preparation. He wrote out his presentation, ordered and clear, every point documented and referenced. He pulled the canvas strip from the tin box and reviewed the coordinates one final time against the homestead claim boundary he'd sketched from the land records. The vein fell inside Corinne's land, clean and unambiguous. Late Sunday afternoon, a rider came from town. Not Sterling's man this time. A young miner's wife who'd ridden out at Mrs. Fletcher's direction with a folded note. He read it at the fence. Mrs. Fletcher had 11 miners willing to be present Monday morning. 11 men who had worked the Blackwood mine and had their own pieces of the story, and had apparently been waiting for exactly this convergence of circumstances to bring those pieces into the same room. At the bottom of the note, in Mrs. Fletcher's sharp, economical handwriting, was one additional line. I have the mining logs. Come early. He read it twice. Then he walked to the barn, checked the mare's shoes, and started thinking about what mining logs meant and what they could prove and how to use them effectively in front of a room full of people who needed to understand in real time what they were looking at. He thought about Corinne in town, in Sterling's orbit, going through Sunday night, in whatever arrangement Sterling had made for her, maintaining whatever composure she was maintaining, protecting her children the only way currently available to her, which was by not giving Sterling a reason to use them. She had walked into that carriage to save his life. That was the plain fact of it, and he'd spent 2 days not letting himself sit with it fully, because sitting with it fully would have made him less functional, and he needed to be functional. He sat with it now, briefly, just long enough to understand what he was carrying into that courthouse tomorrow. Then he put it back in the part of himself where it would wait. He went inside and cooked supper for 4 children, who were very quiet at the table, and kept looking at the door and looking at him, and not asking the question they were all asking. "Will you bring her back?" Gemma said finally. He set a bowl in front of her. "You call her a poor, destitute widow," he said, and paused, and looked around the table at all 4 of them. "I call her the only person in this valley with enough grit to walk 5 miles through a blizzard. To keep her kids alive," he sat down. "If we stay silent while an innocent family is trampled today, it'll be your wives and children tomorrow. That's what I'm going to tell those miners in the morning." He picked up his fork, "And then we're going to go get your mother." Huck stared at him. "Promise?" Gideon looked at him steadily. "I don't make promises I'm not prepared to keep." Huck considered this. Then he picked up his spoon. That was enough. He arrived at Mrs. Fletcher's laundry at 7:30. She was already up and dressed in her Sunday coat, which told him she understood the significance of the morning. On the work table behind her were 2 bound ledger books, old ones, the covers worn soft at the corners from years of handling. "Mining logs," she said before he could ask. "I've had them for 8 months. Frank Vance gave them to me the week before he died. Told me to keep them somewhere Sterling wouldn't think to look." She paused. "I don't think Sterling has ever once considered that a laundrywoman might be holding evidence against him. That's his limitation, not mine." Gideon picked up the top ledger and opened it. The entries were meticulous. Equipment inspection dates, signatures, maintenance requests, and alongside several key entries, notations in a different hand. Frank's hand, he recognized it from the canvas strip, marking discrepancies between what the official log recorded and what the workers had actually reported. The safety latch on the number 3 shaft support appeared 3 times in Frank's marginal notations, each one flagged, each one showing the official record claiming inspection completed, while Frank's notation showed no physical inspection had occurred. The last entry in Frank's hand was dated 4 days before he died. Gideon closed the ledger. "These go with us." "I assumed so," she said, and picked up her coat. They reached the courthouse at 5 minutes to 8. Marsh and Dunmore were already on the steps with 9 other men, a mix of ages, all of them with the particular quiet of people who had made a decision and were past the point of reconsidering it. Mrs. Fletcher moved through them briefly, touching an arm here, a shoulder there, the practiced ease of a woman who had been holding this community together in small ways for 12 years, and was now asking it to hold itself together in one large one. Gideon looked at all of them. "You don't have to say anything you can't prove," he said. "I'm not asking for speeches. I'm asking for presence and for the truth when the truth is called for." Sterling's built everything he has on the assumption that nobody in this valley will stand up together in the same room at the same time. Today we're going to show him. His assumption was wrong. Nobody said anything. Marsh gave a single nod. That was enough. They went inside. The courthouse was a single large room with a judge's bench at the front, a long table for proceedings, and benches along the walls for observers. Sterling was already there, positioned at the right side of the proceedings table with 2 of his men and a lawyer from Helena in a city coat that looked out of place against the rough timber walls. Marshal Hicks stood near the back with his arms crossed. Corinne was seated at the left side of the table with her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when Gideon walked in. For a moment, just one, Her composure cracked open and something crossed her face that she pulled back almost immediately. Then she straightened her spine and looked forward, which was, he thought, one of the bravest things he'd watched her do, and she'd done several. Sterling's eyes moved across the miners, filling the back benches, and his expression shifted by a degree that most people in the room wouldn't have caught. Gideon caught it. Good. Sterling needed to understand the ground had changed. The judge called the proceeding to order. He was a compact man with a gray beard who'd been appointed through channels. Gideon didn't fully know, but who, crucially, was not from Blackwood originally and had not been in Sterling's sphere long enough to be fully managed. That was the best Gideon could hope for, and he was going to work with it. Sterling's lawyer opened with the tax assessment claim. He presented the bank's valuation documents smoothly and with the confidence of a man who expected no serious opposition. Gideon stood up. "I'd like to present the original tax receipts," he said. "Every payment made on this property for 3 years, signed by the county clerk at the time of payment." He laid them on the table, all of them, organized by date, cross-referenced to the county ledger numbers he'd copied from the records office. Sterling's lawyer looked at them. His smoothness developed a small crack. The judge reviewed 3 of the receipts and looked at Sterling's documentation and asked 2 questions that Sterling's lawyer answered less fluently than he'd answered everything before. The tax claim was set aside pending county review. Sterling himself spoke next. His voice was controlled and pleasant, the performance of a reasonable man. He presented the guarantee document, Frank Vance's alleged signature, the bank's position on the homestead claim, and the mineral rights thereunder. Gideon laid the canvas strip on the table. "These are the geological coordinates documented by Frank Vance before his death," he said. "They mark a significant silver deposit. My background as an Army Scout included field surveying, and I've mapped these coordinates against the registered boundary of the Vance homestead claim." He placed his sketch beside the canvas strip. "The deposit lies entirely within Mrs. Vance's legally registered land. The bank has no claim to mineral rights on property it does not hold." He looked at the judge. "I'd also submit that Frank Vance never entered into the guarantee Sterling is presenting. He had no record of visiting the bank in the relevant period, and his character, as multiple people in this room can attest, was specifically defined by his distrust of Sterling's operation." He looked at Marsh. Marsh stood up. He said what he knew, plainly, without embellishment. "The conversations with Frank. Frank's documented distrust of the bank, the mining operations practices. Dunmore stood next and confirmed it. 2 other miners spoke briefly about Frank's character and his stated intentions to report his find through proper channels outside of Sterling's control. Then Mrs. Fletcher stood up. The room got quiet in a particular way. Sterling looked at her with the expression of a man encountering an unexpected variable. "I have the Blackwood mine equipment logs," she said. She placed the 2 ledgers on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been waiting a long time for this moment and intended to do it correctly. "Frank Vance gave them to me for safekeeping 8 months ago. They document a pattern of falsified safety inspections over a period of 14 months, including the inspection record for the number 3 shaft support latch." She opened the top ledger to the page she'd already marked. "The official record shows the latch was inspected and cleared 4 days before Frank Vance's death. The physical maintenance request filed by 3 workers the week before, also documented here, shows the latch was reported as critically worn. No replacement was ever ordered." She looked at the judge. "The site manager who signed off on that inspection," she said, "answers directly to Mayor Sterling." The room held its breath. Sterling's pleasantness was gone. In its place was something colder and considerably more honest. The expression of a man calculating his remaining options and finding the list shorter than he expected. The judge called a recess. It lasted 20 minutes. When he returned, his bearing had changed. He was not a man under Sterling's control. it turned out. He was a man who had been insufficiently motivated to push against it. Evidence changed motivation. The fraudulent guarantee was rejected. The homestead claim remained with Corinne Vance. The mineral rights attached to the claim were confirmed as hers. The judge ordered a formal inquiry into the equipment, inspection records, and the circumstances of Frank Vance's death to be conducted by a territorial investigator outside the county. Sterling stood up. He didn't say anything. He looked at Gideon across the table with the flat, contained fury of a man who had lost and knew it and was already thinking about what came next. Gideon looked back at him without expression. Sterling picked up his hat and walked toward the door. He didn't get far. The trouble started on the courthouse steps. Sterling's two hired men had been waiting outside. When the doors opened and the crowd of miners spilled out behind Sterling, the calculation in those men's faces changed. Gideon saw it before it happened. The shift from standing guard to doing something, the particular stillness that preceded action in men who'd been paid to use force and had just watched their employer lose everything through legal process. Sterling moved fast for a man his age. He was off the steps and into the street before Gideon cleared the door, putting distance between himself and the proceeding, and his men spread to cover him. "Sterling," Gideon called. Sterling turned. His hired men turned with him. One of them drew. Gideon was already moving, off the steps and to the left, using the corner of the courthouse wall the way he'd used cover for 6 years in territory, where the landscape was all that stood between him and a bad outcome. The shot went wide and hit the courthouse doorframe with a crack that sent the remaining observers scrambling back inside. The street cleared fast. Blackwood had the frontier town's practiced reflex for gunfire, everyone finding a doorway or an alley within seconds, leaving the street open. Sterling's second man moved to flank right. Gideon tracked him in his peripheral vision while keeping the first man as the primary problem. He'd learned early in his scouting days that in a 2-on-1 situation, the instinct was to watch both threats equally, which meant watching neither one well. You picked the one most likely to act first, and you committed. He committed. He came around the corner of the wall fast and closed the distance on the first man before the man could reset his aim for a moving target at close range, which was considerably harder than it looked in the dime novels. He got inside the gun arm, controlled the wrist, and the revolver hit the frozen mud of the street. The second man was raising his weapon. Marsh hit him from behind with the flat of his own arm, a heavy, practical blow that came from a man who'd spent a decade swinging a mine hammer and had considerably more force in his arms than most people would guess from looking at him. The second man went down sideways. That left Sterling. Sterling had backed against a freight wagon at the far side of the street, 20 feet back, and he had his own revolver out now, a smaller one, a banker's gun, the kind a man carried for exactly this eventuality and hoped never to use. He had it pointed at Gideon's back, while Gideon was still managing the disarmed first man. Gideon heard the hammer cock. Then he heard something else. The crack and rattle of a gate latch, heavy wood against frozen iron, and then the low, building rumble of hooves on hard ground. A cattle pen stood at the near end of the street, 6 head of winter stock that the feed merchant kept for trade. The gate swung open, and the cattle came through it in a stumbling rush, spooked by the gunfire and the noise, moving with the blind momentum of large animals that had decided direction was less important than speed. Sterling scrambled. His aim broke. He pressed himself against the wagon wheel as the cattle moved past in a churning mass of noise and hooves and breath steam in the cold air. From the hardware store's front porch, Corinne stepped forward. She'd come out during the initial scatter, which Gideon had not seen because his attention had been entirely occupied. She'd found the hunting rifle that hung on the rack inside the hardware store's door, a heavy lever action that the owner kept loaded and displayed as advertisement, which was a common enough practice that she'd counted on it. She raised it, settled her stance, and waited for the cattle to clear. Sterling brought his revolver back up. She shot it out of his hand. Not a lucky shot. A deliberate one, the controlled exhale and trigger pull of a woman who had watched her 10-year-old daughter hit a tin can at 30 yards on her second try and had understood, watching it, that capability ran in the blood. The revolver spun into the mud. Sterling grabbed his hand and made a sound that had nothing dignified in it. The street went very quiet. The cattle had moved down toward the far end and were milling uncertainly near the livery. Sterling stood against the wagon wheel, with his empty hand pressed against his chest, and the marshal was coming down the courthouse steps, and Marsh and Dunmore and 9 other miners were standing in the street, watching him arrive. Sterling looked around the street, at the miners, at Mrs. Fletcher on the courthouse steps with the mining logs under her arm, at Gideon standing 10 feet away watching him with an expression that was entirely calm and had nothing forgiving in it. Then he looked at Corinne, still holding the rifle, her chin level. He had nothing left. The legal case was gone. His hired men were down. His gun was in the mud. Hicks put the handcuffs on him with the mechanical efficiency of a man who was performing a political calculation in real time and had landed on the side of self-preservation. Gideon walked across the street to Corinne. She lowered the rifle and looked at him. There was soot still in the crease of her collar from the barn fire, which she hadn't fully washed out, and her hair was coming loose on the left side, and she was standing in the frozen mud street of Blackwood with a hunting rifle in her hands, and she was the finest thing he'd seen in a very long time. "The children," she said. "Safe at the ranch," he said. "Gemma has them," she exhaled. Just once. Then she straightened her spine, handed the rifle back through the hardware store door to the owner, who was watching from just inside with an expression of profound astonishment, and turned back to face the street. "I'd like to go home," she said. "Yes," he said. "Let's go home." Spring came to Blackwood Valley the way it always did in Montana, argumentatively and in stages, offering warmth and then snatching it back twice before committing to it fully. But it came. By late April, the snow had retreated to the high ridges, and the south-facing slopes had greened up enough to matter. The creek behind Gideon's barn ran high and clear with snowmelt, and the mud season came and went, and left behind ground that was soft and dark and ready. The burned east wall of the barn went up in the first week of May. Marsh and Dunmore brought 6 other miners on a Saturday morning, and they rebuilt it in a single day with timber. Gideon had spent 3 weeks cutting and seasoning. It was better than the original wall, stouter. Marsh had an opinion about corner joinery that turned out to be correct. Corinne fed all of them at noon and again in the evening, and Jed and Huck assisted by getting underfoot in ways that the miners tolerated with the patience of men who had children of their own at home. The silver mine reorganization took longer. The territorial investigator arrived in March and spent 6 weeks in Blackwood reviewing the equipment logs, the inspection records, and the testimonies of 14 current and former mine workers. At the end of his review, he filed a report that resulted in Sterling being held over for trial in Helena, which was a considerably less friendly jurisdiction for him than Blackwood had been. The report also confirmed that the Blackwood mine's silver deposit, including the portion documented by Frank Vance's coordinates, fell within the legally registered Vance homestead claim. Corinne became, overnight, and without any particular drama, a woman with significant mineral assets. She spent 2 weeks thinking carefully about what to do with that. Then she and Gideon sat at the kitchen table for an evening and worked through it together, with the ledger open between them and the lamp burning late, the same way they'd worked through everything else. The mine was reorganized as a cooperative. Every family that had worked the Blackwood mine received an equal share. The working decisions were made by a committee of the miners themselves. Corinne held a founding stake as the claim's legal owner and took a modest operating percentage that was fair and no more than fair. She was careful about that. Fairness was the point. Marsh was elected the cooperative's first manager, which he accepted with the expression of a man who hadn't expected it and intended to earn it. At the founding meeting, held in the Blackwood courthouse, which felt right to Gideon and clearly felt right to others as well, Corinne stood up in front of the assembled miners and their families and said one thing clearly. "My husband found this silver," she said. "He found it for all of us, not for any one person's pocket. That's what this is. That's what it stays." Nobody argued. Nobody had anything to add. The wedding happened on the second Saturday of May. Gideon had proposed the previous Sunday in the most utilitarian manner possible, which was by asking Corinne directly, standing at the fence after morning chores, if she would marry him. He'd prepared nothing. He'd said it when it occurred to him to say it, which was while he was watching her hang laundry in the early morning light and thinking that he was no longer able to imagine the ranch without her in it, and that this was information he should probably act on. She had looked at him for a moment, with the measuring expression he'd come to know well. "Yes," she said. Obviously. He hadn't expected the obviously, but on reflection he thought it was probably accurate. The ceremony was on the porch in the afternoon light, conducted by the circuit preacher, who came through the valley every 6 weeks, and who seemed, by his expression, genuinely pleased to be doing something with a happy outcome for a change. Mrs. Fletcher came out from town and brought 2 of the miners' wives with her. Marsh and Dunmore stood on the yard side of the porch steps. The children wore their leather boots. Toby carried his spool to the ceremony and held it with great seriousness throughout, which no one commented on. Jed and Huck had made a solemn agreement to behave, and they held to it for the entire ceremony and approximately 4 minutes afterward, which, given their nature, Gideon considered a genuine achievement. Gemma stood beside her mother during the vows, straight-backed and clear-eyed, and when it was done, she looked at Gideon with the same level, measuring gaze she'd always had, and nodded once, the nod of a 10-year-old who had made a judgment and arrived at a conclusion she was satisfied with. He nodded back. Same way. In the evening, after the guests had ridden back to town, and the children had worn themselves to exhaustion and gone to sleep, Gideon and Corinne sat on the porch in the cooling dark. The hills to the west were still holding the last of the sunset, a long red line above the ridge that faded slowly to blue, and then to the soft black of a clear spring night. She was leaning against him, and he had his arm around her, and for a while, neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Then he said quietly, "That winter storm didn't just save your family, Corinne. It remade my soul from the ashes." She was quiet for a moment. "It remade mine too," she said. "What was left of it?" He pulled her slightly closer. The creek was running in the dark below the barn. The horses were settled. The children were inside and safe and sleeping in a house that was theirs. He looked at the hills and thought about everything that had brought him to this porch. The war, the grief, the 3 solitary winters in a cabin he'd been filling with silence, because silence felt safer than anything else, and 3 knocks on a door in a blizzard, a woman on her knees in the snow, offering everything she had left just to give her children a chance. He'd pulled the door open. The rest had followed, as the best things did, not from planning or deserving, but from the simple, difficult decision to let another person in from the cold. The night settled over the valley, quiet and full, and the stars came out above the Montana hills one by one, the same stars that had watched over this land long before any of them arrived, and would watch over it long after. But tonight, they watched over something good, and that, for now, was everything. There's something this story keeps coming back to, quietly, underneath all the gunfire and blizzards and courtroom drama, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before you move on. Corinne Vance didn't knock on that door because she was strong. She knocked on it because she had nothing left, except the love she had for her children, and she was willing to trade her own life for theirs without a second thought. That's not heroism the way we usually dress it up. That's just a mother at the absolute end of her rope, making the only choice she had left. And yet that single act, that desperate knock in the middle of a killing storm, set everything else in motion. Every good thing that followed came from one woman refusing to lie down and die quietly. Gideon, on the other hand, had already decided that solitude was safer than connection. 3 winters alone in a Montana cabin. A man who'd seen enough of the world's cruelty to conclude that keeping people at arm's length was a reasonable way to survive it. And maybe it was. But surviving and living are two very different things, and this story understands that distinction completely. The moment he opened that door, he stopped merely surviving. He stepped back into the current of life with all the risk and pain and impossible reward that comes with it. You can't have the warmth of the fire without first letting someone in from the cold. What strikes me most about Gemma, the 10-year-old daughter, is that she never once acted like a child waiting to be rescued. She stood in front of her brothers in a blizzard, with her arms spread back to shield them from the wind. She learned to track animals and read the land. She asked to be taught to shoot, not out of anger, but out of the clear-eyed understanding that capability is protection, and protection was something her family needed. When Gideon told her that being a girl didn't make her any less capable on the frontier, she looked him straight in the eye and said, "I know that." She already knew. She'd always known. She just needed one adult to confirm it out loud. And then there's the community. Mrs. Fletcher, who spent 12 years washing miners' clothes and paying attention, holding evidence in a ledger on a shelf because she understood that the right moment would eventually come. Marsh and Dunmore, men with their own grievances and their own fears, who needed not a speech but a reason, something concrete to stand behind. Sterling had money and legal machinery and the marshal in his pocket, and he still lost because he'd built everything on the assumption that people in this valley would never stand up in the same room at the same time. That assumption was his real weakness, not any legal technicality, not the canvas strip with the silver coordinates, not even the mining logs. His weakness was his contempt for ordinary people, his belief that fear and debt would always hold them in place. It didn't. So what does this story actually leave you with? I think it leaves you with this. The most important decisions any of us ever make aren't the grand ones. They're the small ones. Open the door or don't. Speak up or stay quiet. Let someone in or keep the walls up. Gideon Thorne made one unremarkable decision in the middle of an unremarkable night, pulling a stranger in from a blizzard because it was the decent thing to do, and it rebuilt his entire life. Corinne Vance made one unbearable decision to walk toward a man who might turn her away, and it saved her children and eventually herself. Neither of them knew what would follow. Nobody ever does. That's the whole point. You make the decent choice with the information you have in the moment you're standing in, and you trust that what comes next will be worth it. It usually is. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental.